Over to my house and show me how this works.
Go ahead, Norm.
Everybody, welcome to the penultimate night of the Gainesville Jewish Film Festival. Our film today was Shared Legacies, and it's sponsored by the Samuel Bud Shorstein Chair in American Jewish Studies. Our speaker tonight is Rachel Gordon, a member of the Center for Jewish Studies in the Department of Religion, who is the Samuel Bud Shorstein Fellow in American Jewish Culture. She is currently finishing up a book called How Judaism Became an American Religion with Harvard University Press. And in addition to that, she is working on another book-length project on the film Gentleman's Agreement. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who I think wants to say something about our writing award, I'm guessing, and then we are going to move on to a discussion of the film.
Great, thank you, Norm. So I just want to remind folks, because we changed the date. So our submission here is May 5th, and we've got a few different categories. Two $1,000 awards for a longer research paper, and then this is a shorter one. And these can be from assignments in class or something you've done on your own, as well as a creative submission. So I hope as you're thinking about end of semester assignments and maybe something you want to fix up from last semester, you'll give these some thought. And I'm really glad to see so many students with us today. I think we'll be most interested in hearing, your views of this film, since you're a different generation that's coming to this history. So I thought this was a really important film to have in the festival. First, because as the opening and the ending of the film show, these struggles that Jews and Blacks faced are not over. And the opening and the ending allude to this fact that we're in another moment of national reckoning that has concerned both Blacks and Jews, maybe especially since 2016, when we've seen a rise in white nationalism, which has kind of been a leader in racist acts and a leader in anti-Semitism. So as the film shows, sadly, Blacks and Jews are finding common cause again for these reasons. So I think that the film is a good launching pad for considering, for thinking about what we make of this shared legacy today. I'm in a writing group with Susanna Heschel, who we saw in the film, and I was asking her this week what she thought of it. And I guess I conveyed a little bit of my bias, which is that this feels a little bit dated. And she said she agrees, but for that same reason, and I'll explain more about what she said later, I think it's important because this is the way this Black-Jewish alliance has been told for several decades already, but in the past couple of decades, I think the scholarly view of it has changed quite a bit, so that there's an attempt to reframe this history from what we see in the film. For that reason, I guess I'd question the title of the film a little bit, which is Shared Legacy, because part of me wonders, is this a film that's being shown at Black film festivals? And if not, why not? Is it because this legacy is more important to Jews, and what might be the reasons for that? I think some of the reasons have to do with what the film is showing is sort of a historical memory. And when I say historical memory or historical consciousness, I guess I'm talking about the way we've chosen to remember historical events, and what we've chosen and what we've chosen not to remember about something. And even if the way we craft this story, which kind of shows Jews and Blacks at the center, and I guess I'm really questioning the Jews being so central part of it, the fact that that's the way the story has been told is clearly important to Jews. So whether true or not, I think it's worth examining why has this been so important to Jews, and in what ways? And clearly, as the film shows, it's been very inspiring. I think of my own 1980s childhood in the very white suburbs of Boston at my Jewish day school in Newton, Massachusetts, where we were taught about Martin Luther King Jr. and Martin Luther King Day as being sort of, in some ways, almost as serious as the way we were taught about Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I think that's not uncommon among liberal Jews, even though, and while Jews were, I think, the most active in the civil rights movement among white ethnic groups, most Jews did not go down south to help, register Blacks. Some did, and very sadly, a few were killed. Many more watched it on television and read about it in the paper and saw the photos and felt great pride. And it's not a bad thing to feel pride in at all. But I guess what the scholars have started to point out more is this self-congratulatory or filio-pietistic way Jews have been telling this story for a while. Now, I still think it's important that this is a treasured memory, and Susanna said she also felt that it's really these warm feelings about this specific moment in time when there was this great alliance that then, as the movie showed, sort of broke down in the late 60s, early 70s with the death of Martin Luther King Jr. and the death of Heschel. But part of the scholarly reframing of this moment is to look at what happens next, and what historians have found is that with the rise of Black power, Jews actually learned a lot from that movement. They learned models for ethnic pride, which really inspired a lot of Jewish pride. The Jewish catalog that my parents had in my home growing up, or the Jewish day schools they sent us to, this idea that instead of being quietly Jewish or reducing your Jewishness to something that would be acceptable in the suburbs, you would be kind of public and out there, and that would be cool and popular in the way that Americans were seeing Blacks were able to do in the late 60s and 70s. I'm just looking at what else I wanted to mention at the moment. And so I guess another thing that the film brought up for me was the question of who were the victims in the story they were telling. And I guess, we might ask, why are we just talking about, why am I asking about victims? This is also about like this sort of powerful alliance. But I think part of the myth, and maybe I prefer myth over legacy in the title there, but this myth that we've cherished about Jews being so central to the civil rights movement. And there were some Jews at the center of these iconic photos, and that's the reason we've come to tell the story that way, is that I think Jews have been somewhat attached to what scholars call this lachrymose view of history, that where thinking of oneself as a victim can sometimes be a little bit of a crutch or a comfort. And the reality is, even though we sometimes talk about shared struggles being motivation for this coming together, it wasn't until Jews were, I'm sorry, is that, if we could, great. Yeah, if we can mute the cameras, that would be good. So what I meant to say was that it wasn't until Jews achieved this kind of middle class status that they felt, sort of more able to be in the position of working for Black civil rights. So while we've said, oh, it's out of this shared struggle, Jews were really in a much better position than Blacks in the 60s were. And I think it was partly that better position that allowed them to take part in it. If it were the fact that they both struggled, then we might have seen more of that happening in the 20s and the 30s when Jews were also very much struggling. And then there was some, as we saw with the NAACP, but it's sort of wasn't quite the moment that the civil rights movement was. Another thing I thought the film brought up kind of slightly is this idea of the fact that it's our Judaism or our Jewishness that motivates this involvement. And I guess there too, you know, scholars often ask back, well, wouldn't we see a lot of Orthodox involved if Judaism is really supposed to be the motivation for taking part? So I'm sure many Jews feel that way, but there's issues with that, calling that a cause too. But again, I thought this was important for us to see because it is how the story has been passed down and told and cherished. And it's clearly very important to many Jews and Blacks, although again, I'd be very interested to hear how much this story of Jews and Blacks working together is how it is told and when it is told in, maybe in Black film festivals or in Black communities. So I think it does tell us quite a bit about, and I'm glad to see Ken is here because I was just thinking one of the things I feel like it tells us about is our liberal culture. And I think it actually points to a little bit of American Jewish exceptionalism. We often note how other diaspora communities seem a bit more conservative than American Jews. I'm thinking of even Canadian Jews or Australian Jews or Jews in the UK. And some of our sense of liberalism is our understanding that Jews have been so involved in civil rights causes like this, so I think that's very informative. So again, back to, even if this is partly myth, myths are important and they sort of form our sense of self. And, I, like many other American Jews, grew up with a Jewish education that took a lot of pride in being part of this moment. And that's not a bad thing. It's just something we might want to complicate and look at in a wider context. So I'm curious if I know if Bud is here, because Bud and I have talked a little bit and he might or might not want to share, because he sort of has a longer memory of how this fits with how you understood or remember this time. But do you feel like sharing with us now? I don't know if you're able to unmute or if we might come back to you later.
Did I unmute? There I go. Unfortunately, I don't know what's wrong with my camera because it's not working.
No problem.
But one of the things that I guess struck me as I saw the film was the relationship of the African-American community with the Jewish community in Atlanta, Georgia. And the reasons that so is the years I attended the University of Florida, I ran a dining room for a Jewish camp in North Carolina, which was Camp Blue Star, which had a huge number of Jewish kids from Atlanta. And at the end of our camping season, we would host the Temple youth groups and the United Synagogue youth groups. And I got a chance to meet Rabbi Rothschild during that period of time, which was an extremely dynamic person who was certainly a leader in the liberal movement of Judaism in America. And I guess the other thought that I had as I watched the film is we've gone 360, because as we watched the Senate election in Georgia this year, we see a African-American priest and a young Jew running side by side, but together, and they end up winning the 2 Senate seats in Georgia. And that's extraordinary, but certainly had to take an enormous amount of cooperation between the African-American community and the Jewish community.
Yeah, and I was thinking too how I think Rabbi Rothschild's Bible was used in the swearing in of John.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was very proud of that. Um, yeah, Ken, did you want to talk a little bit about this, what you thought of the film? Oh, I guess you're muted. You able to unmute yourself?
There we go. Yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed the film. I had the story for the most part wasn't new to me, but it was nonetheless great to hear the stories told from the perspective of the people who were engaged with them. And in general, I thought it was pretty solid. I think it left out the importance of the work of the sort of collaboration between Jewish labor leaders in the African American community, which really preceded and continued on in that process. That's an interesting story in itself. And I thought it kind of both muddled through the divisions that came around later in the 60s without really getting into it. And again, I think so much of that reflects what is this continuing New York bias in studies of Jewish history, that if it happens in New York, it's important everywhere. If it happens anywhere else, it's not important, in that sense. And, New York is important. It was at one point the capital city of American Jews, but I don't think it is any longer. It's obviously its share of the population is much smaller. But again, I think, again, I was impressed and I like the style of storytelling and the fact that they didn't do a lot of heavy editing on that. It had an authenticity to it that I found kind of charming. So, yeah, that was interesting.
Thank you, Roy. I know this is probably pretty central to things that you teach, so I'd love to hear what you thought.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to be the Debbie Downer, but no, I mean, I appreciated all your points, Rachel. I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure what is it exactly that sort of rubbed me wrong in the film. Maybe because I like my documentaries with a little more bite. And this documentary, seemed to be really busy in creating, a positive narrative, which I understand that is really needed. Right now, right? We need sort of this feeling that we could bond together, right? And different groups can perhaps sing around sit around the campfire and sing Kumbaya. But I did feel it sort of missed on central issues between the African American and the Jewish American communities. I think the stories that it brought were definitely amazing, but I did also think that it could have perhaps dedicated the second half of the film to perhaps a more critical approach or just a little bit an inquisitive approach to understand also what went wrong or what was wrong. How on one hand we have such a beautiful connection between people like Heschel and MLK, but then on the streets kind of got down in the neighborhood, it wasn't always like that. It was almost never like that. So I thought you could still reach a deep understanding about the two communities, right? But by kind of incorporating more important question. I think one of the big questions that should have been asked is Jews, American Jews, not necessarily. Well, I don't want to sound too harsh, but white American Jews sort of adapting, becoming white, right? I mean, we do talk about it a lot and hear about it a lot recently, and I know many people don't like, many Jews don't like to be affiliated with, with what whiteness means in America, but it's not necessarily white as an ethnicity, but as an adoption of culture, right? I mean, we could say that that Jewish Americans adopted and adapted, also welcomed into white American culture. And this is something that has been criticized also on the other side, on the African American side. I mean, we had African American thinkers and novelists who looked at Black communities during the Harlem Renaissance in the 60s and the 70s, and also kind of say, hey, you guys became you guys got kind of adopting white bourgeois culture, American culture, sort of forgetting about your brothers and sisters, right, in inner cities and stuff like that. So I think, that was important to me, and that narrative that, after MLK kind of passed away, this is where the rift had begun. I feel like, it was kind of a made up, wishful thinking. And it was more Jews moving up the social ladder in the United States, which kind of happened, before the 60s. And of course, the other side, on the other side, there's also discontent from, early as James Baldwin writing about, I remember his New Yorker article that Blacks can't be anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, right? Talking about the sort of rift in the city between Jews and Blacks, and how, Blacks sees Jews mostly as landlords and pawnbrokers. So there's a lot of problems back then, but even going up to, today, Jay-Z sort of using a lot of I wouldn't say anti-Semitic, but Jay-Z, Ice Cube, right? They do have some sort of problem with how they, identify or stigmatize Judaism in Jewishness in their art. And well, I feel like I've been going on forever now, so kind of let the ball pass.
Thank you, Norm.
Yeah, I didn't dislike the documentary, but it seemed to me, well, okay, in the first place, it seemed to me a corrective or an attempted corrective of the movie Selma, which I never saw, but which I read, completely wrote Avraham Heschel out of history. He wasn't in the movie. And I know Susanna was very hurt by that. And so her, the constant presence of him in the movie and the constant presence of her in the movie sort of led me to believe that this being made in 2020 was partly a corrective to that, to sort of stop the leaking sieve of history in a sense, before the Jewish presence in these events is completely forgotten. So that kind of struck me. And I also thought that the movie was a little cowardly at the end. I love hearing old men talk about the good old days, because I'm becoming one talking about the good old days. But at some point, it seemed to me that there needed to be a more serious confrontation about why the movie was made, insofar as this is recognized as the good old days, and what the hell is going on today. It's a nettle that the movie never really grasps, and I get it that that's a whole other movie to make, and probably a longer movie to make. But there is that problem, and it really skirts over, the one rabbi who isn't invited to speak because of Israel, never really getting into these issues one way or another that would leave someone who wasn't terribly initiated with any of this, I think, a little bit more confused than anything else.
Yeah, I just want to mention, since I see some students I know, Barry and Eileen and Gargi, et cetera, you guys are welcome to talk. This is not supposed to actually just be professors, so please feel free to raise your hands, and we'd love to hear from you if you feel like it. I just, Natalia, I don't want to put you on the spot at all, but as someone who isn't used to thinking about the American context, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, if you feel like sharing them. Stephen, I saw your hand before. I'd love to hear from you. Stephen?
Yes. Thank you so much. And in Virginia, thank you so much for inviting me to come to this talk back. I think everyone who has spoken already, I agree with you on some levels. I connect with you, Roy, and when you mentioned all separation, I felt the same way. I truly felt the same way, that it could have gone much further than that, and to be a little bit more in depth about that. And then something else that was mentioned was how, of course, this separation happens after, and I guess, I don't take this the wrong way, I get to a certain degree, there was like this betrayal, so to speak, when, you've got your Jewish friends who are now moving up the ladder of success and moving into what one of the presenters mentioned was the meritocracy. And so one of the things that is missing, because like in as far as this country is concerned, the things that in the definition is in this country, whiteness, and idols. With that said, it seems that it's like, with our friends who had moved onward, perhaps that was a part of the separation, some of the tension behind the separation. I'm not sure, because this was something that I was still a young one when this, when the separation happened, as far as on the timeline. However, I will have to say that, like I said, I definitely agree that I think it really could have gone a little bit more in depth. And then as Norman was saying as well too, where Hollywood has fallen short. Well, the thing is that one of the things we have to remember, because Hollywood fell short when they made the movie Selma, and now we're trying to play catch up with this documentary. So it's just this little fun little thing here to remind you of. Hollywood is not here to educate us. They're not here to educate us. That's why we have documentaries. So thank goodness for documentaries, because that is here to educate us and give us a nice perspective. One of the things that I did find kind of funny, and it was just kind of striking, that Jesse Jackson was in the documentary, and he only had a very short snippet. Now, this is someone who was very close to Martin during movement. He was in that inner circle. And it's interesting that he had such a small part of this documentary. But at the same time, I also felt a little bit uncomfortable for him, because I go back to 1984 presidential elections, and Jesse Jackson, and I don't know if any of you older guard, remember that derogatory remark he made in one of his speeches, and it was just it's like, and I think that which was very unfortunate, because it I think that put the nail in the coffin for him, as his him moving up the ladder for his presidential aspirations at the time. So, and like I said, that was just something that was just very, very interesting, that, Jesse Jackson was in it, but yeah, a small role. And then even just personally, I felt uncomfortable for him, just going back into history, knowing the derogatory remarks he made about the Jewish community. So, yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that because we saw him talking with some rabbis or some kippah wearing folks. So you wondered how they felt about that. Other folks want to? Jack, did you want to say something?
I did. There's a few things I want to say. Just in regard to what Steve had just said, one of the things, as you undoubtedly know, when you're making films, documentary films, not everyone's great on camera. And you get footage and you look at the footage and then you realize it's really not a whole lot of stuff there that you can use, because it comes out rather flat. So we don't really know what he had been like when he'd been interviewed. So the other thing I want to say was that if you think of what this film is doing, and you're thinking in terms of the educational aspect of the film, I'm thinking of the the film sets out right away and tells us what this film's about. And the first few minutes, when it tells these wonderful anecdotes of being in an all-white school where the only Black person is told that he has to dance with the Jewish girl. And that's replayed in his own conversation with this Jewish girl, that it's a story about same story about his father. And I thought that was incredibly powerful, and just, it made my jaw drop. I said, wow, this is really incredible. But I think it clues us into what the film's about. And the film is really, I think, less so about explaining things and much more so about emotional commitments. And the brilliance of the film, where it really works, is that it rekindles a sense of the emotional volatility of this time period, a time when many interesting things really happened in this country. When the country was young in certain ways and had tremendous potential, I think much more so than it currently has. And whether it's all true and whether this relationship between Blacks and Jews is all correct, whether it leads out this and leads out that, to me is less relevant than the fact that it was a very hopeful period. And I couldn't help but watch it with that sense of what was lost. And I think lost less because of what happened between Blacks and Jews than what happened because of what's been happening in the country more generally. But again, I stand on what I said at the beginning of this, my long statement, that it's a film about emotions. And if there's, perhaps shouldn't use the word master narrative here, but there's something that underlies what the film is doing. And I'll just finish with this. One of the drawbacks of this kind of documentary filmmaking is that it decides not to use talking heads. So it doesn't take in the experts, the historians, the political scientists, whatever, who can explain what's taking place, what took place, whatever. And I always find that to be a limitation of the explanatory material within these films. They're relying much too much on reality, much too much on the people who were there and what they experienced, and not enough on experts who can synthesize and pull us together. And from that standpoint, it's no wonder that it's missing things. And again, it's just this caveat that I put on documentary films. I think they do have an obligation to invoke the words of experts who have something to say.
Okay, I think I saw Gargi's hand before. Gargi, did you want to say something?
I quickly put it up and down just because it was a small point of how I just wanted to say that although film doesn't have to educate us, and it's not stated that it has to, I do think that it has and it should tell the full narrative and the full story behind everything. In terms of everything that we've read in class, Professor Gordon, it does kind of, and literary art and film do align, I think, to a certain extent. And I just wanted to say something about how, although it does not have to educate us, it does have to tell the full narrative, and how that is important with documentaries as well. But there's also just that solid truth of how it does not have to educate us. It only, Hollywood was created to entertain first and foremost. So I just wanted to make that small point.
Great, thank you. I'm curious if any of the other students want to answer this. I wondered if this is a story that's known among undergraduates, because I was also talking to Susanna about how when I've taught, and Roy, I wonder what it's like for you, but when I'm teaching about Jews in the civil rights movement, I guess I'm surprised at how unknown this story is. When I was teaching in the fall in a class, a big freshman class, they were all found it very interesting and said they'd never heard about this this Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Jewish involvement. So I wonder what our undergrads or anyone else here thinks about how well known this is among a rising generation.
Yeah. Oh, I can.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and talk. Anyway, so yeah, I think it's pretty unknown because I did not have any idea about it. And like I've learned progressively about the civil rights movement since like fifth grade, and I've been to the Holocaust Museum in fifth grade. In fifth grade as well. And I've learned about Judaism progressively throughout my years of middle, college, and high school. But we never have really, like, in any of my classes, have really talked about the civil rights movement connection and um, how both minorities like connected and worked um, together in the civil rights movement. So yeah, it was unknown to me. So that's why like watching this film / documentary was very interesting to me, because like it kind of walked through the steps of how like the connection happened and how like the connection was able to happen, and I found it very interesting. So yeah, I think it's pretty unknown among undergrads unless they learned about it in a college class or maybe in high school during a specialized class. So just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, thank you. Jamie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, this is completely unknown to me, but to be fair, I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in Texas, Panhandle of Florida, and Alabama. So I'm realizing that there's a lot of history that is unknown to me. I think it speaks a lot about the education in this country, that depending on what state you grew up in, you come out with a completely different education. So that's partially why I've attended all of these meetings and all these discussions, because I didn't meet my first Jewish person until college, and there is just so much that I'm trying to learn and trying to be a part of the community a bit better. So this was, I don't know how more educated or more people who write about this and talk about this stuff a lot, how they felt about this documentary, but for me, it was really cool because it was just something completely unknown to me.
Thank you.
Can I get back to that point Jack made about the very beginning? Because I thinking back on it, it strikes me as very interesting that the guy who's talking at the beginning is Lonnie Bunch, who put together the Museum of African American History, and who kind of modeled it. Not so much on the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, but the idea that you couldn't just have a Jewish museum about the Holocaust, that it had to be an American museum about, American, values of pluralism and stuff like that, or else people would not go. And so, Bunch sort of built on that and said that the African American History Museum has to be an American museum, and maybe this is why it's such a general success. But it is interesting that they started with him, and that and then it's interesting that I don't think they mention who he is,
right?
And they never get back to him, even though he's the guy who put together. He's that expert that Jack was talking about, and they sort of have him in the beginning, and they never quite come back to him. But that's sort of an interesting thing, is that this is it's an African American story, but it's also an American story, sort of writ large.
Yeah, that story in the beginning, I mean, I guess the thing about it to me is it seemed like the only instance where the Jews and Blacks were really in an equal sort of struggle. Even when we see Kivy Kaplan, driving through Florida, and he sees the sign about no Jews and dogs, and he asks his Black driver, the Black driver points out, they don't even bother to mention us, and the Black guy's the driver. I mean, there's real differences. And as we mentioned, this is in an era when Jews had already really moved up on the socioeconomic ladder, in the 60s. So yes, they were involved, but really from a much better position. So I thought that story in the beginning of the film was kind of the only time that I felt like, all right, that really seems like sort of equal marginalization in a way, although there's probably a lot more going around for the Black child than for the Jewish, but
sort of the generational memory too.
Yeah,
that I thought was very interesting, because we obsess about 2Gs and 3Gs and Holocaust memory and that sort of thing. You don't really think about third generation slaves and that sort of thing. And yet whoever it was who said this, that, you know, the trauma of slavery doesn't end with slavery, and it doesn't end with that particular generation, but it's something that continues. I thought was a very interesting connection between the two, because yeah, one of the other things going on these days is what exactly is the connection between you know, Holocaust, the Holocaust and colonial crimes, the Holocaust and slavery, and you know, that was kind of an interesting point that was made as well, that is sort of developed in the film. But
yeah, I just want to read our student Barry's comment here. He says, while film is typically made for entertainment purposes, it has often served as a method to spread new ideas and promote them. In many ways, Hollywood is an important aspect of foreign policy, as it exports a lot of American ideals to the rest of the world. Good point. You know, but I was just wondering though, since, you know, you were growing up you were a young man in the South at this time, did this seem like a Jewish thing to be working in the civil rights movement, or did it seem like a rare thing that some people did?
I think it was more to the Jewish Southerner. I don't think they were particularly close to the movement, unfortunately. I don't think they really understood the movement. It really took the more liberal aspects of the Jewish communities of the North to empathize with the African American community. And I don't think the Jewish Southerner, by and large, had that same feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the film actually was very good in explaining why they wouldn't. I mean, the practical implications, it made sense to me. But I go back to what I said earlier about why having talking heads explaining things would be so helpful. Because making the comparison between the Holocaust and slavery, I mean, there's nuances there that need to be teased out. And these are not easy things to do, not easy things to explain. But I think would have made I like the film, but nonetheless, I think it would have made it a lot stronger intellectually. I want to say something to what Barry Schneider had put in, and that is that I think you have to distinguish documentaries from Hollywood films. Documentaries are not primarily meant to entertain, although they do entertain, and this one certainly does. But Hollywood films are primarily intended to entertain. And so there is a genre difference here that's worthwhile keeping in mind.
I was glad to see the sort of reinscription of Heschel, and I did think Susanna is an expert. So there were a few talking heads in there. I didn't have an issue with that. I was struck also by obviously it's a narrative that's a model to follow. This is what we want to get back to. The good old days are there. But having grown up kind of in the 70s and 80s, I'm not sure that model was there. I am not sure it's just a question of the South, because I know that, you know, in New York, we were having to be returned to school for race riots and had helicopters land on the football field. So a lot of what really happens, I'm going to say post 67 even, and then post 73 is completely, you know, wiped aside in the film. And this, I mean, I understand the message, and I heard the Jewish imperative to justice, which is, you know, very similar to, you know, what many liberal Jews will say Judaism is. But I found that, especially having lived through post 16 and post the Women's March dissolution, which dissolved on race to a large extent, it really is a very happy, you know, let's go back to that. And I don't mind the nostalgia or the message or the didactic message, but I was struck by how much it leaves out, even with that frame of the present. And then also it makes it seem as if there was this wonderful moment when, yes, you know, all American Jews, not just a rewrite in, but, and continued until now. And that certainly, you know, wasn't my experience in the United States growing up at this time. And I'm kind of between your generation and your generation. So just Yeah. And then on length, well, given the length, they certainly could have gotten them in.
Yeah, among things, oh yeah, I just was going to quickly say that the issue of Black Jews, actually, we saw some Black Jews, but we didn't really discuss, I mean, it's now thought that between 12 and 15% of American Jews identify as people of color or Jews of color. So they didn't really quite take that on, because even to talk about a Black Jewish alliance sort of doesn't recognize, it makes it sound like you're sort of one or the other. And it didn't really go into that. But what were you going to say?
I wanted to come back to the Southern Jew in the 60s, because that Jew probably was much more familiar with the things the Ku Klux Klan was doing, which was certainly anti-Jewish as well as anti-African American. Probably was thankful that they weren't in the middle of all of this in some way, because they'd been part of so much anti-Semitism in the South. And that may be why they did not do as good a job as empathizing with the African-American community that the Northern, more liberal Jews were able to do.
Thank you.
I'm not even sure many Northern Jews did. It's nice to have these examples. But certainly as a little kid, I don't remember people that active. There were people who were active in the communities in which I grew up or my cousins grew up. And most often, I think they would have been, depending on the neighborhood, it's a very Jewish neighborhood, fine, Cedarhurst, Five Towns, but no, they would be scared. They would also be nervous and just be glad that they're not being bothered in the neighborhood. Yeah, I don't think it's that different.
Yeah, they brought up, Gail, what you said reminded me that they brought up Joachim Prinz, who we were talking about this Holocaust civil rights connection. It's not, again, I don't think a majority of Holocaust survivors were taking part in the civil rights movement, but it's nice to have the Prinz example of a rabbi who, this former rabbi of Berlin, who had a New Jersey congregation, who really felt, having seen what happened there, how can I allow for silence? We can't be a country of onlookers, he says in that speech before King. So I think we really like to make that connection between the Holocaust and Jews' desire to be involved in the civil rights movement, and maybe many younger Jews feel it when they look back, but I'm not sure about the survivors themselves. Of course, some of them were, trying to make lives for themselves.
It's a tough call in a film.
Yeah.
Because the message, what message do I want to get across? It's going to be, the message, yes, I'd like you to follow this. When it comes down to it, you want to set that, best model if it's feasible. So I don't have, a problem with that this is what we'd like to aspire to, being the dominant story. I found, Rosie.
Ken, I'm sorry, I think you were.
Well, I was just going to sort of remark that I'm not sure the Holocaust connection is absent either. And I know this is, a story rather than data in the plural, but I grew up in a small city in the Midwest where there were more Native Americans than African Americans, and there weren't very many of each other. So I didn't have each of them. So I didn't have a lot of exposure to the African American community growing up. And I remember when I was a kid, I'm naturally interested in the news. I would watch the films of Black demonstrators being hosed and being attacked by, vicious dogs and the like. And I was horrified, and yet I didn't quite understand where this was coming from. So I asked my father, who was a survivor, why do so many white people seem to hate, and I used the polite term that we were taught, which was Negroes. Why is there such hostility? And I remember my father paused for a second, and he then looked at me and he said, well, I don't really know, he said, but I can tell you that people who don't like Negroes usually don't like Jews either. And in a way, that was all I had to know in my life. In a way, that sort of defined a lot of my political principles, because there was a sense that we shared some common bonds, some common experience, and with all the degrees to which comparing these experiences is a challenge, it still was very, very powerful. And I think, and it's even more important because my father was the Jewish Republican in the state of Nebraska. There was a quota of one, and he was it. So he was not by any means a flaming liberal, but that's the connection he saw. And that's part why years later he left the Republican Party. So again, it's an example, but we had mostly survivor families in our network. And they were certainly not activists, but almost all of their kids were, because we kind of picked up these lessons.
I think it's important to say that there definitely is a connection between Blacks and Jews. We don't really know what it is, and also in the Holocaust and slavery. Toni Morrison dedicated her beloved. Her novel Beloved to the 60 million that died in the Atlantic slave trade, right? So we don't know the number of victims, right, of Africans that died during that years, but just to say, have the number 6 in a million. I mean, we know that there is, that there is some sort of a connection, right, between the Holocaust and slavery, and there's definitely a connection that is alive and existing and thriving between Jews and Blacks. I mean, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. Cornel West, I think, said that we're like Jews and Blacks are like a family, maybe not functioning, maybe at each other's throats, but still a family after all. And I mean, think about the KKK, and you look back now at the images from Charlottesville. I mean, there is a reason why the two groups are kind of brought up as one, or as having a connection. And I think if any, this is where the film really shines. And I think it is important in that regard. And I'm sure that I'm going to show clips from the film to my classes. I taught a class about passing last semester in African-American literature and Jewish literatures. And I had kids from African-American studies and kids from Jewish studies, and each side was, they thought that Blacks and Jews are kind of mutually exclusive groups. I mean, they didn't have, any idea that there was a bond, that there is a bond. And we watched Black Klansman at the end of the year, the film, I'm blacking out on Spike Lee's Black Klansman, right? And I think we left out as a group with kind of a much deeper connection and appreciation, right, to each side. So I think it's definitely there, and it needs to be cultivated. And this is and this is why it is after, with its fault, it's a very important it is an important film, with all the caveats, right?
Yeah, I mean, Roy, what you just said sort of reminded me of the comment about MLK and Heschel chemistry, and this like special relationship that just sort of, soul brothers, is sort of a romance. I mean, there was a golden era for Jews and Blacks that I guess we need to remind ourselves about. Stephen?
It really does my heart good to hear you say that there is a connection, and however, we're not sure what that, where it comes from, what it's really all about. And just seeing that this connection, even going back to the Niagara movement, when there were Jews and other liberal white allies that came together during the Niagara movement, and which formed its way into what we now know as the NAACP. Once again, it was formed by liberal whites and Jews, taking us into the civil rights movement. Once again, liberal whites and Jews. And now here we are into Black Lives Matter, this movement. Once again, there are allies, liberal whites, Jews, what have you. But what is very striking for me as Black in this country, is that we always have to call out the cavalry. And our cavalry is liberal whites and Jews. And it is so difficult because it's like, to be an African American in this country, if we want to get anything done economically, politically, we need to have white allies. And that is just like, it's really sad that after all these years, any that Americans coalesce around as important to them and their and trying to move forward with it and make some progress, we're not taken seriously until we actually have allies. That's something I just wanted to share. Allies. Don't get me wrong, we all need allies because we're not alone. But it is sad and very sad, telling are in this society. African can't out having some white approval. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that came up, I thought very movingly when I think it was one of the descendants of Schwerner or Goodman mentioned that he finally understood, you know, that it was only because there were two white Jewish men lost that there was so much attention to those three young men who died. Any other comments here? Well, it was great to get to hear from so many people this evening. Nice to hear so many voices.
Thank you, Rachel.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Majana.
Rachel, thanks so much for what? Oh, yes.
Thank you, Rachel.
Before you people go, listen to the advertisement.
Yes, listen to the commercial. Rachel, thanks so much for leading the discussion. It was great to have everybody here this evening. Our final film is Saturday, Der Schäumer. I'm reading that it is about a malevolent entity, and so perhaps it's only fitting that our own Dragan Kujundžić will be giving the commentary. This is, again, our last film. The talkback is at 8:30, not 7:30. And of course, there's no film tomorrow night. I hope to see everyone there. And Shabbat Shalom.
Norm, could I just say something for a moment about the film? It's a very unusual film. It's sort of experimental. And, you know, it's very audacious that it tries to join contemporary Yiddish film. So it's not bad Yiddish, there's some Yiddish in it. And the horror. And if you like horror, you definitely should watch the film. And if you don't like horror, well, just, you know, I don't know, watch it with someone who can protect you. I don't know. It's a fun film.
Looking forward to it. Everybody, have a good night.
Bye. Thanks.
Have a good night.